Enoch Soames by Max Beerbohm. When a book about the literature of the 1890s was given by Mr. Holbrook Jackson to the world, I looked eagerly in the index for Soames Enoch. I had feared he would not be there. He was not there, but everybody else was. Many writers whom I had quite forgotten are remembered, but faintly lived again for me. They and their work in Mr. Holbrook Jackson's pages. The book was not as thorough as it was brilliantly written, and thus the omission found by me was, and all the deadlier record of poor Soames's failure to impress himself on his decade. I dare say I am the only person who noticed the omission. Soames had failed so piteously as all that, nor is there a counterpoise in the thought that if he had some measure of success, he might have passed, like these others, out of my mind, to return only at the historian's beck. It is true that he had his gifts, such as they were. Being acknowledged in his lifetime, he would never have made the bargain I saw him make, that strange bargain whose results have kept him always in the foreground of my memory. But it is from those very results that the full piteousness of him glares out. Not my compassion, however, impels me to write of him. For his sake, poor fellow, I should be inclined to keep my pen out of the ink. It is ill to deride the dead, and how can I write about Enoch Soames without making him ridiculous? Or rather, how am I to hush up the horrid fact that he was ridiculous? I shall not be able to do that, yet sooner or later, write about him I must. You will see in the due course that I have no option, and I may as well get the thing done now. In the summer of '93, a bolt from the blue flashed down on Oxford. It drove deep. It heartlingly embedded itself in the soil. Dons and undergraduates stood around, rather pale, discussing nothing but it. Whence came it? This meteorite. From Paris, its name. Well, Rothenstein, its aim, to do a series of 24 portraits in lithograph. These were to be published from Bodley Head, London. The matter was urgent. Already the warden of A and the master of B and the Regius professor of C had meekly sat, dignified and doddering old men, who had never consented to sit to anyone, could not withstand this dynamic little stranger. He did not sue. He invited. He did not invite. He commanded. He was 21 years old. He wore spectacles that flashed more than any other pair ever seen. He was a wit. He was brimful of ideas. He knew the Whistler. He knew Edmond de Goncourt. He knew everyone in Paris. He knew them all by heart. He was in Paris and Oxford. It was whispered aloud so soon as he had polished off his selection of dons, he was going to include a few undergraduates. It was a proud day for me when I was included. I liked Rothenstein not less than I feared him, and there arose between us a friendship that has grown ever warmer, and been more and more valued by me with every passing year. At the end of the term, he settled in, or rather meteorically into London. It was to him I owed my first knowledge of that forever enchanting little world in itself, Chelsea. I made first acquaintance with Walter Sickert and other august elders who dwelt there. It was Rothenstein who took me to see, in Cambridge Street, Pimlico, a young man whose drawings were already famous among the few. Aubrey Beardsley by name. With Rothenstein, I paid my first visit to the Bodley Head. By him, I was inducted into another haunt of intellect, and daring the domino room of the Café Royal. There, on that October evening, there in the exuberant vista of gilding and crimson velvet set amidst all these opposing mirrors and upholding caryatids with fumes of tobacco ever rising to the painted and pagan ceiling, and with the hum of presumably cynical conversation, broken into so sharply now and again by the datter of dominoes, shuffled on the marble tables, I drew a deep breath, and this indeed, said I to myself, is life. And pagan is material culture rather than religious culture in actuality, but Shia Islam actually has narrations about the heights of the ceilings, that one shouldn't be so ostentatious about the height of rooms. Now, if you have a connection between levels, that's one thing. But yeah. It was the hour before dinner. We drank vermouth. Those who knew Rothenstein were pointing him out to those who knew him only by name. Men were constantly coming in through the swing doors and wandering slowly up and down in search of vacant tables, or of tables occupied by friends. One of these rovers interested me because I was sure he wanted to catch Rothenstein's eye. He had twice passed our table with a hesitating look, but Rothenstein, in the thick of a disquisition on Puvis de Chavannes, had not seen him. He was stooping and shambling of person, rather tall, very pale, with longish and brownish hair. He had a thin, vague beard, or rather he had a chin on which a large number of hairs weakly curled and clustered to cover its retreat. He was an odd-looking person, but in the 90s, odd apparitions were more frequent, I think, than they are now. The young writers of that era, and I was sure this man was a writer, strove earnestly to be distinct in aspect. This man had striven unsuccessfully. He wore a soft black hat of clerical kind, but of bohemian intention, and a gray waterproof cape, which, perhaps because it was waterproof, failed to be romantic. I decided that dim was the mot dust for him. I had already essayed to write, and was immensely keen on the mot just that holy grail of the period. The dim man was now again approaching our table, and this time he made up his mind to pause in front of it. You don't remember me, he said in a toneless voice. Rothenstein brightly focused him. Yes, I do, he replied after a moment, with pride rather than effusion. Pride in a retentive memory. Edwin Soames. Enoch Soames, said Enoch. Enoch Soames. Repeated Rothenstein in a tone implying that it was enough to have hit on the surname. We met in Paris 2 or 3 times when you were living there. We met at the Café Groch. And I came to your studio once. Oh, yes. I was sorry. I was out. But you were in. You showed me some of your paintings, you know. I hear you're in Chelsea now. Yes. I almost wondered that Mr. Soames did not, after this monosyllable, pass along. He stood patiently there, rather like a dumb animal, rather like a donkey looking over a gate, a sad figure his. It occurred to me that hungry was perhaps the mot juste for him. But hungry for what? He looked as if he had little appetite for anything. I was sorry for him, and Rothenstein, though he had not invited him to Chelsea, did ask him to sit down and have something to drink. Seated, he was more self-assertive. He flung back the wings of his cape with a gesture which, had not those wings been waterproof, might have seemed to hurl defiance at things in general, and he ordered an absinthe. Je me tiens toujours fidèle, he told Rothenstein. De la sur 6 glaces. It is bad for you, said Rothenstein dryly. Nothing is bad for one, answered Soames. Dante que monde, il n'y a ni de bien ni de mal. Nothing good and nothing bad. How do you mean? I explained it all in the preface to Negations. Negations? Yes, I gave you a copy of it. Oh, yes, of course. But did you explain, for instance, that there was no such thing as bad or good grammar? No, said Soames. Of course, in art, there is the good and evil, but in life, no. He was rolling a cigarette. He had weak, white hands, not well washed, and with fingertips much stained by nicotine. In life, there are illusions of good and evil, but, his voice trailed away to a murmur in which the words Vieux Joe and Rocco were faintly audible. I think he felt he was not doing himself justice, and feared that Rothenstein was going to point out fallacies. Anyway, he cleared his throat and said, Parlons de autre chose. Well, in a way, there are ideas of good and evil because it's your consciousness behind it. It's the circumstance. If something's been somehow made necessary for survival, what is bad for you or whatever, it's, well, you're surviving, so in some way it's good for you, but it's your consciousness to it. And something good, again, it can lose its value with the wrong consciousness and be turned contrary to value. It occurs to you that he was a fool. It didn't to me. I was young and had not the clarity of judgment that Rothenstein already had. Soames was quite 5 or 6 years older than either of us. Also, he had written a book. That Rothenstein had not been there, I should have revered Soames. Even if it was, I respected him, and I was very near indeed to reverence. When he said he had another book coming out soon, I asked if I might ask what kind of book it was to be. My poems, he answered. Rothenstein asked if this was to be the title of the book. The poet meditated upon this suggestion, but said he rather thought of giving the book no title at all. If a book is good in itself, he murmured, waving a cigarette. Rothenstein objected that absence of title might be bad for the sale of book. Well, people might call it the red book, or whatever color the book was printed in, right? If he urged, I went into a bookseller and said simply, have you got, or have you a copy of? How would they know what I wanted? Oh, of course, I should have my name on the cover, Soames answered earnestly. And I rather want, he added, looking hard at Rothenstein, to have a drawing of myself as frontispiece. Rothenstein admitted that this was a capital idea and mentioned that he was going into the country and would be there for some time. He then looked at his watch, exclaimed at the hour, paid the waiter, and went away with me to dinner. Soames remained at his post of fidelity to the galoshes witch. Why were you so determined not to draw him? I asked. Draw him? How can one draw a man who doesn't exist? He is dim, I admitted, but my not just fell flat. Rothenstein repeated that Soames was non-existent. Still, Soames had written a book, asked if Rothenstein had read Negations. He said he had looked into it, but he added crisply, I don't profess to know anything about writing. A reservation, very characteristic of the period. Painters would not then allow that anyone outside their own order had a right to any opinion about painting. And this law, graven on the tablets brought down by Whistler from the summit of Fujiyama, imposed certain limitations. If other arts than painting were not utterly unintelligible to all but the men who practiced them, the law tottered. The Monroe Doctrine, as it were, did not hold good. Therefore, no painter would offer an opinion of a book without warning you at any rate that his opinion was worthless. No one is a better judge of literature than Rothenstein, but it would have done to tell him so in those days. I knew that I must form an unaided judgment on Negations. Not to buy a book of which I had met the author face to face would have been for me in those days an impossible act of self-denial. When I returned to Oxford for the Christmas term, I had duly secured Negations. I used to keep it lying carelessly on the table in my room, and whenever a friend took it up and asked what it was about, I would say, oh, it's rather a remarkable book. It's by a man whom I know. Just what it was about, I never was able to say. Head or tail was just what I had made of that slim green volume. I found in the preface no clue to the exiguous labyrinth of contents, and in that labyrinth nothing to explain the preface. Lean near to life, lean very nearer. Life is web, and therein nor woof is but web only. It is for this I am Catholic in church and in thought, yet do let swift mood weave there what the shuttle of mood wills. These were the opening phrases of the preface, but those which followed were less easy to understand. Then came stark account about a midinette who, so far as I could gather, murdered or was about to murder a mannequin. It was rather like a story by Petuil Mendes, in which the translator had either skipped or cut out every alternate sentence. Next, a dialogue between Pan and Saint Anula. And Saint Ursula. Lacking, I felt a snap. Next, some aphorisms entitled aphorismata, route. In fact, there was a great variety in form, and the forms had evidently been wrought with much care. It was rather the substance that eluded me. Was there, I wondered, any substance at all? It did not occur to me. Suppose Enoch Soames was a fool, a prop, a rival. Hypothesis. Suppose I was. I inclined to give Soames the benefit of the doubt. I had read Le Après-midi de une femme without extracting a glimmer of meaning. Yet, Mallarmé, of course, was a master. How was I to know that Soames wasn't another? There was a sort of music in his prose. Not indeed arresting, but perhaps, I thought, haunting and laden perhaps with meanings as deep as Mallarmé's own. I awaited his poems with an open mind, and I looked forward to them with positive impatience after I had a second meeting with him. This was on an evening in January. Going to the aforesaid domino room, I passed a table at which sat a pale man with an open book before him. He looked from his book to me, and I looked back over my shoulder with a vague sense that I ought to have recognized him. I returned to pay my respects. After exchanging a few words, I said with a glance to the open book, I see I am interrupting you, and was about to pass on, but I prefer, Soames replied in his toneless voice, to be interrupted, and I obeyed his gesture that I should sit down. I asked him if he often read here. Yes, things of this kind I read here, he answered, indicating the title of his book, The Poems of Shelley. Anything that you really, and I was going to say admire, but I cautiously left my sentence unfinished, and was glad that I had done so, for he said with unwonted emphasis, anything second rate. I had read little of Shelley, but of course, I murmured, he's very uneven. I should have thought unevenness. Evenness was just what was wrong with him, a deadly evenness. That's why I read him here. The noise of this place breaks the rhythm. He's tolerable here. Soames took up the book and glanced through the pages. He laughed. Soames' laugh was a short, single, and mirthless sound from the throat, unaccompanied by any movement of the face or brightening of the eyes. What a period, he uttered, laying the book down. And what a country, he added. I asked rather nervously if he didn't think Keats had any more or less beheld his own against the drawbacks of time and place. He admitted that there were passages in Keats, but did not specify them. Of the older men, as he called them, he seemed to like only Milton. Milton, he said, wasn't sentimental. Also, Milton had a dark insight. And again, I can always read Milton in the reading room. The reading room of the British Museum. I go there every day. You do? I've only been there once. I'm afraid I found it rather a depressing place. It seemed to sap one's vitality. It does. That's why I go there. The lower one's vitality, the more sensitive one is to great art. I live near the museum. I have rooms in Yacht Street. And it's important to, quiet one's reactions from time to time. And you don't have to do this through drugs. And you go to the reading room to read Milton. Usually Milton, he looked at me. It was Milton. He certifically added, who converted me to diabolism. Diabolism? Oh yes, really, said I. Said I with that vague discomfort. that intense desire to be polite, which one feels when a man speaks of his own religion. You worship the devil? Soames shook his head. It's not exactly worship, he qualified, sipping his absinthe. It's more a matter of trusting and encouraging. Ah, yes, but I had rather gathered from the preface to negations that you were a Catholic. Je petais a kete epoch. Perhaps I still am. Yes, I am a Catholic fabulist. Just like later Anton Cézanne Lavey says that people are going to have, starts with people saying they're atheistic Satanist and they're going to be Christian Satanist. And there's movements that are like that. This profession he had made in an almost cursory tone. I could see that what was upmost in his mind was the fact that I had read Negations. His pale eyes had for the first time gleamed. I felt as one who is about to be examined, gave a voice on the very subject from which he is shakiest. I hastily asked him how soon his poems were to be published. Next week, he told me. And are they to be published without a title? No, I found a title at last. But I shan't tell you what it is, as though I had been so impertinent as to acquire. I'm not sure that it wholly satisfies me, but it is the best I can find. It suggests something of the quality of the poems. Strange growths, natural and wild, yet exquisite, he added, and many-hued, and full of poisons. I asked him what he thought of Baudelaire. He uttered the snort that was his laugh, and Baudelaire, he said, was a bourgeoisie malgré. France had only one poet, Villon, and 2/3 of Villon were sheer journalism. Verlaine was an épicier malgré lui. Altogether, rather to my surprise, he rated French literature lower than English. There are passages in Villiers de la Isle Adam, but I, he summed up, owe nothing to France. He nodded at me. You'll see, he predicted. I did not, when the time came, quite see that. I thought the author of Fungoids did, unconsciously of course, owe something to the young Parisian descendants. Decadents are to the young English ones who owed something to them. I still think so. The little book bought by me in Oxford lies before me as I write. Its pale gray buckram cover and silver lettering have not worn well, nor have its contents. Through these, with a melancholy interest, I have again been looking. They are not much, but at the time of their publication I had a vague suspicion that they might be. I suppose it is my capacity for faith, not poor Soames' work, that is weaker than it once was. To a young woman, thou art, who hast not been, pale tunes irresolute, and traceries of old sounds, blown from a rotted flute, mingle with noise of cymbals rogued with rust, nor not strange forms in the scene, lie bleeding in the dust, being wounded with wounds. For this it is, that in thy counterpart of age-long mockeries, thou hast not been, nor art. There seemed to me a certain inconsistency as between the first and last lines of this. I tried with bent brows to resolve the discord, but I did not take my failure as wholly incompatible with a meaning in Soames' mind. Might it not rather indicate the depth of his meaning? As for the craftsmanship, rogued with rust, seemed to me a fine stroke, and, not instead of and, had a curious felicity. I wondered who the young woman was, and what she had made of it all. I sadly suspect that Soames could not have made more of it than she. Yet, even now, if one doesn't try to make any sense at all of the poem, and reads it just for the sound, there is a certain grace of cadence. Soames was an artist, insofar as he was anything, poor fellow. It seemed to me, when first I read Fungoids, that, oddly enough, the diabolistic side of him was the best. Diabolism seemed to be a cheerful, even a wholesome influence in his life. Nocturne. Round and round the shuttered square, I strolled with the devil's arm in mine. No sound but the scrape of his hooves was there, and the ring of his laughter and mine. We had drunk black wine. I screamed, I will race you, master. What matter, he shrieked, tonight? Which of us runs the faster? There is nothing to fear tonight. In foul moon's light. Then I looked him in the eyes, and I laughed full shrill at the lie he told, and the gnawing fear he would fain disguise. It was true, what I'd time and again been told. He was old, old. There was, I felt, quite a swing about that first stanza, a joyous, rollicking note, comradeship. The second was slightly hysterical, perhaps, but I liked the third. It was so bracingly unorthodox, even according to the tenets of Soames' peculiar sect in the faith. Not much trusting and encouraging here, Soames triumphantly exposing the devil as a liar, and laughing full shrill, cut quite a heartening figure. I thought then, now in the light of what befell, none of his poems depresses me so much as Nocturne. Now, if you're making up things against somebody, that doesn't expose anybody but yourself. I looked out for what the metropolitan reviewers would have to say. They seemed to fall into two classes, those who had little to say and those who had nothing. The second class was the larger, and the words of the first were cold, insomuch that strikes a note of modernity throughout. These tripping numbers, Preston Telegraph, was the only lure offered in advertisements by Soames' publisher. I had hopes that, when next I met the poet, I could congratulate him on having made a stir, for I fancied he was not so sure of his intrinsic greatness as he seemed. I was but able to say, rather coarsely, when next I did see him, that I hoped Fungoids was selling splendidly. He looked at me across his glass of absinthe and asked if I had bought a copy. His publisher had told him that 3 had been sold. I laughed at a jest. You don't suppose I care, do you? He said, with something like a snarl. I disclaimed the notion. He added that he was not a tradesman. I said mildly that I wasn't either, and murmured that an artist who gave truly new and great things to the world had always to wait long for recognition. He said he cared not a sou for recognition. I agreed that the act of creation was its own reward. His moroseness might have alienated me if I had regarded myself as a nobody, but hadn't both John Lane and Aubrey Beardsley suggested that I should write an essay for the great new venture that was afoot, the Yellow Book, and hadn't Henry Harland as editor accepted my essay? And wasn't it to be in the very first number at Oxford? I was still in statu capillarity In London, I regarded myself as very much indeed a graduate now, one whom no Soames could ruffle, partly to show off, partly in sheer goodwill. I told Soames he ought to contribute to the Yellow Book. He uttered from his throat a sound of scorn for that publication. Nevertheless, I did, a day or two later, tentatively ask Harlan if he knew anything of the work of a man called Enoch Soames. Harlan paused in the midst of his characteristic stride around the room, threw up his hands towards the ceiling, and groaned aloud. He had often met that absurd creature in Paris, and this very morning had received some poems in manuscript from him.